75 precincts in New York. And 3/4 of the precinct captains figured out once they understood the metrics, they couldn't do it. It was too new, it was too difficult, it was too hard. And the metrics were simple. Can you reduce crime? They weren't how many people did you arrest? Can you reduce crime? Because they weren't actually interested in saying, congratulations, you live in the precinct with the most arrests, which is not actually a very comforting model. So I really recommend strongly that this is the beginning of how we make it different. I think it's very important to create commissions where you go out to people in the world that works, and this is, by the way, an enormous problem in the federal government now, because we've made it so hard for people to offer advice that if you're really wealthy and you're really successful, people just won't do it anymore. But I really would suggest to you, in every state in the country, there are people who operate every morning in the world that works. They know the rhythm of it, they know the patterns, they do it for a living. They're not just theoretical. And if every governor had an advisory group of people who were actually doing this, and you said to them in the broadest way, all right, if you wanted to lead this state into the world that works, how would you do it? You're going to be stunned at how many, and I got into this because Fred Smith at FedEx came in for breakfast one morning with General Chuck Boyd, as an old friend of mine who runs business executives for national security. And we talked about how do you get, I was at that time, as I still am, I was on the Defense Policy Board, and I said, so how do we get the FedEx UPS rhythm? And he said, you can't. He said, as long as the federal government cannot distinguish investment from cost, you will never make the investments it took to create FedEx and UPS. Now his conclusion was it's hopeless, and he went back to Memphis to make more money. My conclusion was he had just defined for me one of the great challenges in the next 10 years, which is how do you rethink OMB and CBO so they actually distinguish investment from cost, and so you actually can make multi-year investments that actually have payouts. And I would just suggest to you, every one of you knows people personally who've helped your campaigns who are brilliant in the world that works, who if you actually said to them, so what would you do? Don't tell me what you do in terms of what the local editorial board says or in terms of the local politics. Just tell me in a genuine sense, how would you operate in the world that works? I think you'll be stunned how exciting and how dynamic their ideas are. And then you've got advocates who go out to the legislature and who go out to the news media who aren't you. They're the most successful people in your state. I would also suggest you create science and technology advisory groups from both experts and practitioners to look at this whole notion. If it's really going to be 4 to 7 times as much new science, how do we absorb it? How do we learn from it? How do we apply it? How does that change our tax laws? I mean, for example, as a minor thing, it makes very clear to me the federal government ought to have a permanent R&D tax credit. I mean, we ought to have 100% expensing for new machinery. I mean, there are things that begin. When you start really taking seriously, show me a world of this. And all of you have great universities in your states that have terrifically bright people who could be the beginning of this. And most of you have in your states startup companies that have terrifically competent people who used to be at your universities and are now much richer. And all those folks can be advisors on if this is true. And I'm prepared to defend the 4 to 7 number as being pretty accurate. Develop prizes, as I talked about earlier. What are the 5 things your state that would really make breakthroughs in your state decisive, and what prizes are worth? How do you quantify it? If we could find a vaccine next week for Alzheimer's, that's a $1.2 trillion item and enormous human pain. So what's that worth to us? 5 million? 100 million? Ironically, it turns out in Washington you can't offer a prize, because if you offer a prize, you have to actually set aside appropriated funds even if the prize isn't going to be reached for 20 years. And no appropriator who's rational is going to put $1 billion aside for 20 years when they could spend it this year. So you have to change the rules in Washington to say that prizes only count the year they're issued, not the year that you start. It took from 1919 to 1927 for the Orteig Prize to lead Lindbergh to fly from New York to Paris for $25,000. Under U.S. Congress current today, you'd have to score the money in 1919. Even though you didn't spend it until 1927. So the whole system's anti-prize right now. But take a look at that and think about what would really be exciting and what would really be worth offering rewards for. I think that green conservatism is important, particularly important to the Republican Party, for the following reason. One of the 2 highest scores in 6 polls was the question, do you believe we have a moral obligation to take care of the legacy our creators endowed us with? 95% of the country agrees that some kind of environmentalist, conservationist model is right. And so when people come in and say to me that they're not interested in this, then I think they're not interested in the people they represent. But what's happened to us is we've allowed the left to define the environment. So you have to be for more regulation, more trial lawyers, bigger government, higher taxes, more controls, or you're anti-environment. I think that's nuts. I used to teach environmental studies in the early 70s. I actually was the coordinator of environmental science at West Georgia College. I taught in the Second Earth Day. I think that the model of environmentalism, where you use incentives, you use entrepreneurs, you use science and technology, you create better answers, not better regulations, is both politically popular, and we have all sorts of data on that, and it's also practically popular. And so I would strongly urge you to look at the whole concept of how do you apply green conservatism in your state, and how do you maximize both, and in my mind, it's both energy and the environment. The two are very interlocked, but there's enormous underlying economic and national security drive to energy that is in addition to the drive about the environment itself. We believe at the Center for Health Transformation, and Jim Frog will be glad to talk to any of you about this, that we want to create a 21st century personal, intelligent health system. And Governor Perdue has been just a tremendous leader for us in Georgia in helping put this together. We've been talking with Governor Sanford about doing some things in South Carolina. And Governor Pawlenty came in recently and helped us with a Medicaid workshop. I just want to suggest to you there's a model. My personal estimate is, having spent since 1999 on this, we have between 20 and 40% waste in the current system, but there is no way to get at it politically. New York State, it's estimated by the New York Times, has a $4.4 billion a year fraud in Medicaid alone. A four-part series. When they said fraud, they mean, for example, dentists who filed for 982 procedures in one day. A dental office in Brooklyn that had somebody who stood out front who said, if you'll loan us your Medicaid card, we will give you a free DVD player. I mean, this is genuine fraud. You have to design a new model that you move the system to for both financial reasons, but even more importantly, for human reasons. Now, I'll give you the example we work on the most is diabetes, where we've been working with Dominique Wilkins of the Atlanta Hawks, and we've designed a program for young people called a full court press in diabetes. You can't have a society that has 12, 13, and 14-year-old kids so obese that they get type 2 diabetes by the time they're 19 or 20. It's not possible, because that means you're going to have a workforce that's getting kidney dialysis at 27. But everybody tries to hide from the scale of change. And I don't want to take the time to go into this in detail. This is a topic I'd be very glad to do a workshop online about, really with whoever you'd like to designate. But I can tell you, you have to think first, we have a four-box model. You have to think first about the individual. Because if you don't change individual behavior, nothing you do is going to work. And changing individual behavior is both hard and risky. So if you want to really change individual behavior, you got to say, all right, what would a healthy country be like? Well, you'd have wellness, you'd have constant testing, you'd have prevention, you'd have, when you knew somebody had a chronic condition, you'd have early intervention, intensive education, incentives for good behavior, cost for bad behavior. Governor Bush at one point, I think, is running an experiment in Medicaid now, where if you're compliant as a diabetic on Medicaid, you get a reward at the end of the year. Because it turns out then you don't go to the emergency room as often. There are a whole series of these things. The second box is, so what do you do about the culture and society to reinforce it? For example, every school breakfast and school lunch program should be appropriate for a diabetic. Because the truth is, if they're appropriate for a diabetic, they're appropriate for everybody. I would argue you shouldn't have any kind of junk food available in schools prior to 5 o'clock. Either have machines that get turned off, that only turn on at 5, or have machines that have things that are healthy. I would also argue that you have to have K through 12 physical education 5 days a week. You're not going to get the scale of change you need without getting the scale of change you need. I mean, real change requires real change. We're in the mess we're in because we're in the mess we're in. And we keep trying to say, but can I offer 3 press releases to tell you I'd like to get out of the mess? And the answer is it ain't going to happen that way. Now, I'll give you one other example that may be too radical. A sign of my age. I actually think we should contemplate that walking a mile or 2 to school is good. That you take the next 5 years of the bus driver's salary and you apply it to building a sidewalk, and you just say, we're not providing bus service within a mile of the school.